Heroes are great and all, but come on, what really turns an MCU movie from good to great is a fantastic villain at its center. And although the MCU has been going for over a decade now, there's still a ton of villains the franchise needs to introduce. All these bad guys on today's list could cause serious trouble for Earth's mightiest heroes and completely change everything, don't you think?
Oh boy.
I mean, when will we see Magneto?
My brothers.
Will Thunderbolt Ross ever become Red Hulk?
Don't worry about me.
Is Morlun the next big Spidey villain? Let's get into it right now.
Whoa.
I think out of any villain yet to be introduced, the biggest one, almost literally, that fans want has to be Galactus. The giant purple planet eater is a major threat in the comics, and honestly, it's a little weird we haven't heard any mention of him so far. Like, he's definitely out there, right? Maybe the MCU is trying to figure out how exactly to fit the giant cosmic entity into their overall story. Because the simple explanation would be to just make him a celestial. They did that with Ego, the living planet after all, but huge Galactus fans, or Galactheads as I like to call ourselves, know that he's actually a remnant of the previous universe that carried over, so he's technically even older and more powerful than the Celestials. Maybe the MCU will have him be the big threat to the Celestials, and Earth helping stop him will convince the Celestials to not crack us open like an egg? One of the most important non-cosmic villains that need to show up in the MCU is Doctor Doom. And yes, I mean actually Doctor Doom. The previous Fox versions of the character made the baffling decision to not adapt the character properly, not just once, but twice. Like, is it so hard to have a supreme leader of Latveria be a big threat to our heroes? But to be fair, both of the previous versions had the difficult task of providing an origin story for the Fantastic Four, and there wasn't time to introduce a Victor Von Doom that wasn't tied directly to Marvel's first family. But the MCU is a massive place now. You could easily introduce Doctor Doom in something like Black Panther 2 and have Latveria battle Atlantis and Wakanda in a power struggle, and then have the Fantastic Four fight him in their own movie. That would work, right? Just please, MCU, get him right this time.
Trespassing on Latverian soil.
Honestly, I didn't care that much about Mephisto until WandaVision.
Where is he?
And then, when Marvel's Devil didn't actually show up after weeks of hints and constant online speculating, I was majorly disappointed.
Boner.
And at this point, the MCU's just teasing us, right? Like when the No Way Home trailer first came out, there was that huge shot of a poster saying Peter was the devil in disguise, which was a reference to how this specific comic storyline originally featured Mephisto as the one that erased everyone's memory. I mean, people even thought that Doctor Strange was actually Mephisto in disguise, but the devil still hasn't made an appearance. Where's he at? After all the fan theories, he has to face Wanda at some point, right? With Adam Warlock officially entering the MCU in Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, we're all left wondering just what type of character he's going to be. In the comics, Adam's greatest comic arc is tied with the Infinity Gauntlet and Thanos, but he wasn't around yet in the MCU to be a big player in Infinity War or Endgame. So what happens now? Well, in the comics, Adam Warlock has an evil side thanks to a split personality known as Magus, who's incredibly dangerous. I sense a strong thematic parallel between the Guardians trying to befriend Adam while fighting the evil version of him, while also trying to find a different version of Gamora to bring her back on the team. I think it makes sense.
Gamora.
As much as we all want the mutants and the X-Men to be introduced in the MCU, that also means all the mutants' villains will also be free to roam around and cause havoc. That's a scary thought because a lot of them are just devastating. Take Onslaught, for instance. Onslaught is an Avengers movie type of threat. His story has been switched up a few times, but his big one is that he's the sentient psionic entity created from the consciousness of Charles Xavier and Magneto. The amount of damage this villain can do should terrify any hero, and maybe the creation of Onslaught down the line will be the catalyst for the X-Men and the Avengers to team up? Maybe. So Galactus and Doctor Doom are big Fantastic Four villains, but they're not first movie villains, you know what I mean? We know a Fantastic Four movie is coming, so who's a big enough threat for Marvel's first family to face? Why not Annihilus? The baddie is the ruler of the Negative Zone, which in the Ultimate comic universe is what gave the Fantastic Four their powers. So a movie with the Negative Zone at its center would be perfect for Annihilus.
A spot in this wretched universe.
He's your classic, let's take over everything so I can live longer type of villain, and he even comes with his own MacGuffin in the Cosmic Control Rod. If I was a betting man, I'd bet Annihilus will face the Fantastic Four sooner rather than later in the MCU. What would Magneto be like in the MCU? You really can't have mutants and the X-Men without the Master of Metal, but also you have to follow in the footsteps of two near-perfect performances. As wonky as the Fox X-Men movies could get, both Ian McKellen and Michael Fassbender brought gravitas, charm, and tragedy to their portrayals of Magneto, where anyone else has huge shoes to fill. Plus, how do you bring in Magneto in today's MCU? The core of Magneto's character has always been how he's a Holocaust survivor. But now that it's like the 2020s in the MCU, that age issue means a big change might have to happen, right? Unless, of course, they make it where it's the 1980s or 90s in whatever universe the X-Men come from? That sounds fun. The Hulk's rage-fueled personality has been seriously neutered in the MCU lately, and honestly, it's just not as fun. I want the angry Hulk to smash things again. That's why bringing in a character like Maestro would be the shot in the arm the character needs right now. Maestro is an alternate future version of the Hulk who rules over the apocalyptic wasteland that once was Earth, and thanks to a nuclear war, the villain is even stronger and more intelligent than normal Hulk. I think the next big Avengers movie should be an adaptation of Secret Wars, which means bringing in the Beyonder to the MCU. The Beyonder is one of the most powerful beings in the entire universe and has always been fascinated with humanity and their beliefs about reality. That's the setup for Secret Wars, which sees the uber-powerful being transport a lot of heroes and villains to a place called Battle World so they could fight it out for the Beyonder's enjoyment. So there's a relatively new villain in Marvel Comics, but it's actually a familiar hero. Let me explain. There's a version of Gamora out there who eliminated Thanos herself and set off on her own quest to get the Infinity Stones, taking on the mantle known as Requiem. This villain version of the character could technically be adapted into the MCU with the upcoming Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. Maybe 2014 Gamora has spent her time on her own doing assassin-like things with the Requiem moniker, and it's up to the Guardians to bring her back to the side of good. Well, to the side of kinda good, right? What if there was a villain with all of the Fantastic Four's powers? Well, you're in luck. There is one. Super Skrull is a Skrull warrior created by the Skrull Empire because they were pretty angry at the Fantastic Four for thwarting one of their invasion plans. And so their solution was to create a fighter that could do everything the Fantastic Four could do, except better. I really like the idea of the Fantastic Four facing one villain with all their powers because it would highlight that sometimes teamwork and strategy is better than just being on your own. So bring on Super Skrull. Thaddeus Thunderbolt Ross has been in the MCU since basically the beginning now, and yet we still haven't seen him transform into Red Hulk. What gives? Come on, if they're bringing Abomination back for a sizable Phase 4 arc, then the least they could do is give us some Red Hulk action. I want the Hulk to face one last great threat in the MCU, and seeing him trade blows with Red Hulk would be a fight more than a decade in the making. You know, a few years ago when we were in the middle of like Phase 2 of the MCU, the giant floating head villain known as M.O.D.O.K might have seemed a little far-fetched. But now,
Hands out!
Give me more M.O.D.O.K. There's no reason why M.O.D.O.K wouldn't work in the MCU now, with his big head and little arms causing all sorts of mayhem and mischief in the MCU. And in fact, if rumors are to be believed, he's on his way. Lately, there's been reports of M.O.D.O.K appearing in Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania, but the rumors are all over the place. Some people say that Corey Stoll's Darren Cross will return as the MCU's version of M.O.D.O.K, who was disfigured thanks to the Quantum Realm, and others are saying none other than Jim Carrey will be playing the character in the third movie.
Time to change the world.
Look, the Fox X-Men movies are really hit and miss, and unfortunately, X-Men Apocalypse was a big miss. They ruined one of Marvel's best evil mutants, and hopefully the MCU can bring a better version of Apocalypse to the big screen. Alright, I just want to keep the mutant train going for a second. Mr. Sinister, just a great name by the way, had a lot of references in the Fox X-Men movies, but that now will never pay off. So it's time to bring Nathaniel Essex into the MCU. Thanks to genetic engineering, Essex became an ageless, chalky white, vampire-esque character obsessed with creating a perfect species of superhumans. Of course, genetic engineering makes him a prime villain for the mutants and the X-Men, and it's a villain that would work well in the MCU. Yeah, ever since No Way Home, I've just been thinking about ways that we can reunite the three Spider-Men again. And that's where Morlun comes into play. Morlun was the main villain in the comic Spider-Verse storyline, where the vampiric being traveled across the multiverse, devouring every Spider-Man and Peter Parker he could get his hands on. If the MCU wanted to make a faithful live-action Spider-Verse film, then Morlun is the villain to make it happen. Cyclops is a character who never got the spotlight he deserved in the X-Men films. Making him the third wheel to the Wolverine and Jean Grey love story really set the character back, and while Wolverine became the face of the franchise in live action, comic readers know Cyclops is a much bigger deal than the movies made him out to be. Which is why when the X-Men are brought into the MCU, that Scott Summers should be the new center of the group, not Wolverine. You can do this by forming most stories around Scott, like the introduction of Vulcan, Scott's other brother who's an Omega-level mutant that can control vast amounts of energy. Yeah, he could be bad news and a worthy adversary for the X-Men in a way that puts Scott Summers front and center. With Daredevil and Kingpin back in the MCU, it's only a matter of time before we see other Daredevil allies and villains pop up. The one I'm most excited for is Bullseye. One of Daredevil's best villains, the guy who can hit anything with just about anything, can challenge Daredevil in unique and interesting ways. But the big question is, do you bring in the version of the character who just had an origin story in the Daredevil TV show, or do you reboot the character for the MCU? That's actually a really tough question because both options are plausible and could work. Alright, this one technically might break the rules because Leader did appear in the MCU, but just not on screen. Samuel Stearns had a head wound that got infected with Hulk blood in The Incredible Hulk, which was a tease for the character to become the villain known as the Leader in a later movie. Of course, that didn't happen, but a tie-in comic centered around Black Widow shows that right after Stearns is infected, he wakes up to find his intelligence amplified to extreme levels. Natasha then swoops in and promptly arrests him. Even though he started off as just a regular dude named Herbert Windham, the crazed scientist was given a way to unlock genetic code and kept upgrading himself with power and armor, where he soon became one of the smartest and most powerful villains in the universe, known as the High Evolutionary. Thanks to his evolutionary accelerator machine, this villain was able to accelerate his personal evolution, making him at times close to all-powerful. Thor's new journey, where he basically wants to travel around and have space adventures to reignite his passion for life, means he's going to come across some wild characters and villains. That's where Amatsu-Mikaboshi, aka the Chaos King, comes into play. The Chaos King is the god of evil and chaos, if you couldn't guess, and is honestly downright terrifying in appearance. This would be a new type of villain for Thor to face, and I would love this new comical version of Thor to go up against such a demented evil in one of his solo movies, wouldn't you? Let's stick to Thor villains for a second. So Thor is the Asgardian god of thunder, and I've long held the belief that future Thor movies should see Thor interact with other gods in the universe. So yes, that means the MCU should introduce Thor to the Greek gods, which includes the god of war Ares. Yes, Ares has already been the main villain of the Wonder Woman film, so chances of seeing him in the MCU are slim. But I think there's a way to introduce Ares and the other Greek gods in a way that stands apart from what the DCEU has done. Okay, one last Thor villain, I promise. Mangog is the physical manifestation of the hatred of a billion beings from a race that was slaughtered by Odin long ago. In the comics, this beast is imprisoned in Asgard, and since the MCU has now reduced Asgard to space dust, maybe a part of Thor 4 could center around Thor gathering up the creatures that have now escaped out into the cosmos. That would be a fun way to continue Thor's new character arc, with him establishing a new legacy of cleaning up Asgard's past misdeeds. With the Armor Wars series coming up, it's the perfect time to introduce Crimson Dynamo, basically the Russian Iron Man. Introducing Crimson Dynamo to Armor Wars means you could probably include Red Guardian somehow, which is a great idea because the fan favorite character doesn't have a return set yet after his scene-stealing turn in Black Widow. Okay, this last one I just picked for the name, Tiger Shark. Come on, he's a giant shark humanoid creature that's basically the MCU's version of King Shark from DC Comics. He's naturally an enemy of Namor, and with the Submariner playing a role in Black Panther 2, I'm holding out hope for an appearance of Tiger Shark. You can never have enough giant shark humanoid creatures in your life, don't you think? So these are all villains we need to see in the MCU, but what about heroes we want to see turn into villains? That's a whole other video idea, but given there's now a dark Doctor Strange about to be introduced, how would our heroes fare against evil versions of themselves? That's a good question.